Good morning, everyone. This image depicts a screenshot of my iPhone during a visit to Ukraine last October, warning me of an imminent missile attack when I was in the shower, when I realized I had 20 minutes to get to a bomb shelter. A colleague had asked me to install this app. However, as you well know from the media, these air raid alerts and their aftermaths are a common everyday occurrence in Ukraine for many Ukrainians. More than 3 years have elapsed since Russia invaded Ukraine, bringing with them the purposeful, extensive, and well-documented damage to the destruction of Ukraine's cultural heritage. And yet that damage and destruction has an earlier 20th century history, which I've illuminated in previous presentations at Colgate University, NYU, AIC in London, and links to those talks are on my firm's websites. For the first half of this presentation, however, I'd like to focus on two integral aspects of our work: conservation science and the treatment of artifacts. I'll illuminate the historical context and the voices of those fields to give you a context and understanding 3 years into the war as to why Ukrainians are reaching out to the West for conservation knowledge and why some of them are presenting here today. Although the early history of conservation science focuses on developments in Western Europe, one little-known pioneer was the 1868 Ukrainian-born Wasyl Stravinsky. Educated at the Federal Polytechnic Institute in Zurich, Switzerland, he became the head of the Department of Painting Techniques and at the Institute of the Archaeological Technology in St. Petersburg in 1919 during the Russian Revolution. Fluent in ancient Greek, Latin, and leaning on the publications of English, French, Italian, and Russian researchers, his critical essays were widely circulated, though only posthumously published in book form in 1935. Enamored with the analysis of pigments, one of his insights from his early writings in 1908 are still very applicable today. Quote, "Particularly significant results can be expected from the implementation of optical and chemical analyses in the study of pigments. This promises to provide us with a complete and precise understanding and palette of each of the great masters of antiquity." End quote. As an avid collector, he willed his connection to the Khanenko Museum, Ukraine's preeminent museum of Western and Asian art, which was damaged in a missile attack in the first year of the war. However, with their 1920s and 1930s Ukrainian language publications, including chemical formulae and notations, the husband and wife chemists, Varvara and Fedor Lukhanko, consciously laid the foundation for conservation science in Ukraine as we understand it today. Working in tandem with other leading chemists and restorers, they performed pigment and binder analyses, utilizing microchemical methods, utilized UV illuminated photographs, and measured canvas fiber tensile strength using a Schopper dynamometer. In a recent analysis of the procurement records of the restoration workshop of the Lavra Museum complex in the capital Kyiv from the 1930s, Tatiana Timchenko, head of the conservation department at the National Museum, National Academy of Fine Arts and Architecture in Kyiv, documents in her forthcoming paper the various chemicals purchased by the center, including potassium dichromate. This chemical is notable in our field for its reaction with lead-based pigments, such as the 19th century yellow pigment lead chromate, known today as chrome yellow, widely used by artists in the time. In her 1932 book, Chemistry for Artists, Varvara Lukhanko describes the various chemical methods of lead chromate production, writing them out in scientific notation. She also mentions how pigment how this pigment degrades due to exposure to ultraviolet light and polluted air, writing out the chemical's reaction with hydrogen sulfide. In the 1920s and 1930s, the restoration workshop likely utilized potassium dichromate and microchemical testing to detect and verify the use of this discolored yellow pigment. Varvara Lukhanko's views on conservation science from over 80 years ago are still prescient even today. From her handwritten, unpublished article in 1940, which was recently transcribed, quote, "The technical examination of a work of art must precede the work of an art historian." Interesting idea, don't you think? Or, "The purpose and objective of a technical examination is to provide factual material for the art historian for their conclusions." Or, "A major deficiency today is that no educational institution trains specialist technologists in paintings research." End quote. This last comment is very applicable to Ukraine today. Although the initial 20th century treatment of Ukraine's artworks was craft-based, one restorer, Mykola Kasparovich, set himself apart due to his skill level, knowledge of European paintings gained through extensive travels, and circle of friends. He was part of a progressive, European-oriented group of artists and conservation scientists, and he knew Varvara and Fedor Lukhanko personally. His surviving journal from the late 1930s of the treatment of the 16th century Apostle Peter and Paul icon from the National Art Museum of Ukraine, recently transcribed, is revealing. It contains all of the concepts we utilize today in our documentation, such as title and description of the object, measurements, maker's marks, construction, signs of insect infestation, description of the ground and paint layers before and after the removal of overpaint layers, pigment identification, list of photographs, etc. His notes highlight how up until the 1930s, conservation science and the treatment of artworks in Ukraine were evolving in lockstep with European developments. However, political change began in the late 1920s and 1930s in Moscow's party elites. They became deeply concerned about the success of Ukrainization, to which they responded with a period of wholesale destruction of the Ukrainian people and their culture. The Communist Party of Ukraine, on orders from the Moscow party elite, implemented the Holodomor, the purposeful famine of 1932 and 1933, in which millions of Ukrainians died. In the cultural sphere, numerous masterpieces of 16th and 17th century wooden architecture, such as the Church of the Ascension, Berezna Village, were destroyed. It also included the purposeful destruction of the 12th century St. Michael's Golden Domes Cathedral in Kyiv in 1937, a destination for centuries for Ukrainians, since this was a site for pilgrimages. It was also accompanied by the execution of a noted Ukrainian art historian, Mykola Makarenko, a year later in 1938, a preeminent Ukrainian historian and archaeologist who would not accede to the purposeful misdating of the cathedral, thereby legitimizing its destruction. The restorer, Mykola Kasparovich, who I'd mentioned earlier, was executed as well, also in 1938. Those events left deep psychological scars on the nation's psyche. After World War II and its destruction, the Soviet period ushered in a different, more complex phase in the development of conservation science and the treatment of objects. Due to the Iron Curtain, contacts and exchanges of conservation knowledge and techniques with the West were minimal. Russian became the mandated language of art restoration in the Soviet Union, and writing on art matters in Ukrainian was marginalized. Ambitious Ukrainian restorers needed internships in Moscow or Leningrad to develop their careers, which was then officially sanctioned with a rigid certification system. One example of one such certificate is here. Even so, Western conservation concepts were slowly being assimilated. One notable example is the Sorochinsky iconostases, a masterpiece of Ukrainian Baroque art reaching a height of 17 meters and a width of 22 meters, with 130 icons. Where large replacement missing carved sections were left devoid of gesso and gilding, differentiating replacement from original sections. The Soviet period also ushered in the rescue of cultural artifacts. Boris Vozhnitsky, the director of the Lviv Art Gallery and a giant of that period, discovered the Baroque carving master Johann Georg Pinsel and grew his museum collection from 11,000 to 63,000 objects, creating 15 new museums, overcoming numerous obstacles. And yet, at the same time, even into the late 1960s, works of art were being purposefully destroyed and artists quietly killed. One notable example was the destruction of the stained glass mural created for KU University, depicting Ukraine's national poet, Taras Shevchenko, by the female artist, Alla Horska. A year after its destruction, she was murdered on November 23, 1970. Detailed documentation of the murder, revealed only decades later when the archives were finally opened, strongly point to the work being of the KGB secret police. The opening of those archives and others occurred when Ukraine declared independence in 1991. And that meant that Western researchers began to visit and write about Ukraine and share their historic preservation and conservation knowledge and expertise. Architectural issues were initially addressed with numerous conferences and exchange programs organized by Myron Stockew, an architectural historian who headed the Fulbright program in Ukraine from 2006 to 2012. Olha Yerema-Vinar, a Ukrainian-educated PhD textile conservator, joined the staff of the Metropolitan Museum in 2002 and shared her expertise with colleagues in Ukraine. I introduced the conservation of wooden artifacts, teaching under the Fulbright program from 2017 to 2020. For their part, during this period, Ukrainian language conservation publications began to exhibit a more scientific character, echoing the ambitions of the 1920s and 1930s. Yet the solid progress made during those pre-war years was insufficient to prepare Ukrainian conservators for the challenges of the Russian invasion. The historical context I described earlier was now about to be repeated. The initial days of the invasion of February 22, 2022 were traumatic and chaotic, as the Ukrainian museums, their staff, and collections were unprepared for the war. A week later, I published an appeal on the Global Conservation Forum entitled Ukrainian Culture at Risk, again, which led to many offers of assistance from my AIC colleagues. I also prepared a materials packing list for ICON in London, which they used to jumpstart a comprehensive international emergency effort relying on the support of numerous international foundations. These foundations facilitated the delivery of water mist fire extinguishers and boxcars of packing materials to Ukraine. Olha Yerema-Vinar initiated a series of Metropolitan Museum packing and handling videos, drawing on the expertise of the museum's textile, paintings, book and paper, and photography departments. When the war began, conservation scientists, individual conservators, private firms, and foundations worldwide made donations very generously of conservation supplies, extractors, microscopes, and one example here, to the Department of the Conservation at the Academy of Fine Arts and Architecture in KU. In April, 2 months into the war, I made a special appeal to a meeting of ANAGPIC, the Association of North American Graduate Programs in Conservation, which led to personal introductions with the heads of conservation teaching institutions in Ukraine. Deborah Hess-Norris recorded a video introducing herself at the University of Delaware Conservation Program. Mikita Yavorsky, a young conservation student at the National Academy of Fine Arts and Architecture, and I launched Blue Sky, a secure Telegram messaging site, potentially linking Ukrainian conservators with their peers in the West. Many conservators reached out with offers to form relationships. Sarah Lowengard, to whom I am very grateful, gave of her time and effort to support these initiatives. In contrast to the successes of delivering emergency packing materials, forming relationships via Blue Sky in times of war proved to be too big of a challenge, except for one critical success, which I'll mention later. One crucial reason for this was the language barrier. At that time, and still true today, only a small minority of Ukrainian conservators and conservation faculty were fluent in English. Another factor was that there was such a large conservation knowledge gap between well-meaning conservators in the West that any initial conversations had limited success. Lastly, the most significant factor was the war itself. After the publication of war crimes and atrocities in Bucha, Irpin, and Mariupol, many conservators fled the country, becoming displaced and kept in minimal contact. Taking stock of these situations, I realized that the West conservation knowledge should be made more widely accessible to Ukrainians. Tatiana Timchenko, head of the conservation program at the National Academy of Fine Arts and Architecture, and I began work on an English-Ukrainian conservation glossary for Articheck, an iPad condition reporting software. That effort created the foundation for a larger initiative when 2 Ukrainian conservators in the UK expanded on our work to begin a Ukrainian language add-on to the AIC Wiki Conservation Glossary. This led in turn to my renewing an effort I had begun before the war. The translation of Michel Marinkola and Lucretia Carger's The Conservation of Medieval Polychrome Wood Sculpture into Ukrainian. The Ukrainian publisher Rodovid and I financially subsidized that edition, and this 3-year project was realized under the harsh conditions of the war, with the internet was now frequently down in Ukraine, when my Ukrainian colleagues did not know if they would survive to the next day, or even if their efforts would be worth the cost. Last autumn, the book's presentation was greeted with great success and enthusiasm. It also created demand for more conservation translations. Recently, the faculty administrators of all the conservation training and teaching programs in Ukraine have signed a petition to fund the Ukrainian translations of the updated IIC Science for Conservators series, which I had read decades ago. The one notable success of Blue Sky mentioned earlier was that Sarah Stanage, the executive director of IIC in London, noticed my posting and reached out to me. She was very concerned about the plight of Ukrainian refugee conservators, many of whom had made it to the UK. After discussing the situation, Sarah offered those refugees free IIC membership, admission to IIC conferences, access to IIC's database of historical articles, and stipends to tide them over. Recently, She awarded a Ukrainian conservator a full stipend to attend this month's AIC paintings course and international symposium in Beijing. These acts of goodwill are laying the foundation for Ukrainians to eventually form their AIC regional group. Other initiatives were also fruitful. When the invasion broke out, historically significant and little-known wooden churches in eastern Ukraine close to the war zone were at risk. I began an advisory relationship with the nonprofit Red Arch Cultural Heritage Law and Policy Research and its president, Carolyn Guile, who secured funding for a Leica digital architectural scanner. Mariana Kaplinska and Ihor Bokala, two Lviv University faculty members, executed those scans and will present on this topic later today. This project caught the attention of National Public Radio, which created a segment on their broadcasts. The generosity of the Temerity Foundation covered their travel expenses for this event. I and my Ukrainian colleagues are grateful to these foundations for their contributions. Expanding on the topic of instrumentation, private funding recently contributed to the donation of a UV spectrometer to the Andrei Sheptytsky National Museum in Lviv, one of Ukraine's largest, whose laboratory up to this point had consisted of a Soviet-era polarized light microscope. Lastly, on my trip to Ukraine last autumn, I lectured and taught workshops in microscopic wood identification, meant to address the current situation in Ukraine, where many thousands of Ukraine's icons are mostly unsigned and not reliably dated. This knowledge is a necessary precursor for the future dendrochronological dating of their icon collections. I want to thank the many AIC members and those sympathetic to our field who gave of themselves to preserve Ukraine's cultural heritage and in doing so, maintain its identity. And to ask you, the audience, and members of AIC in the future to be welcoming of new Ukrainian members when they step up and come forward to join the world conservation community. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for your powerful talk, Yuri. We do have time for questions. If anybody has any, you could come to the microphone. I was wondering to start, could you talk more about like how we can support our global colleagues and what are they asking, or like how can we help?
I think at the moment, the best option for support is to work through AIC and IIC and to lend your hand to various initiatives. There are many initiatives at the moment, not only through the acquisition of knowledge, but also through the acquisition of instrumentation. So if you have a spare XRF somewhere in the corner or in a closet of your institution, the Ukrainian museums would welcome such an example of contemporary instrumentation. There's only one XRF for the whole country, and that's at a private firm in Ukraine. So there's a whole step up in instrumentation that's needed, but also a step up in the knowledge base. So the potential efforts of IIC to create future educational experiences for Ukrainians is a necessary step for them to join us in our efforts.
If people have resources that they're able to give, could they contact you in order to
I think the solution would be to contact me simply because I have relationships with many conservators, museum directors, and cultural historic preservation individuals and their organizations in Ukraine. So most of my day, since I'm retired now, is spent on WhatsApp or Telegram in various conversations, just trying to solve lots and lots of problems which would be considered relatively basic here for this audience, but for them, it's a step in the right direction. Thank you very much for your attention.